respect did you yourself feel your narrative voice change in this second novel, Electra?
It was quite a change in tone from Ariadne. Electra is a much darker novel, and the women of Electra are really driven very much by their rage. And so to try and kind of capture the tone of that anger and that desire for revenge was definitely a shift for me. Whereas Ariadne is a much more idealistic, optimistic character. The women in Electra are much more pragmatic and realistic about the horrors of their situation. All the time in the backdrop, the Trojan War is raging, and that lends this very claustrophobic intensity to the novel, which was very different.
Indeed, I loved both novels. Now, for your readers and our viewers right now, as they well know, I'm sure, Electra's story is told by Euripides, by Sophocles, by the plays. We also have Aeschylus's trilogy, and there are lots of modern retellings. If you were to name but one, Morning Becomes Electra by Eugene O'Neill would definitely be my choice. Now, why did you feel drawn to this particular story?
So I knew that I wanted to write something that was set in the Trojan War, because it's such a cataclysmic moment in Greek mythology, and it's so crucial and so important to so many different myths. But I didn't want to be on the battlefield with the men. I was really interested in exploring the wider ripple effects of the war and the effect that it has on the women who have no choice. And so it was these particular women that I was interested in following, because I felt that with Clitemnestra and Electra, it was the opportunity to explore a very twisted mother and daughter dynamic, a relationship between two women that goes to such very extreme lengths. And I was just really fascinated by what would drive them to become that way. I very much kind of understood that Clytemnestra is driven by this powerful maternal grief. But I so wanted to explore the other side of this from Electra's perspective, how it feels to be the daughter who's left behind. And when it came to Cassandra, I just think her plight is so unique in Greek mythology and so utterly fascinating and tragic that she can see the future and she knows her city will be destroyed. But she has this incredible strength and resilience that she keeps trying to fight against that inevitable outcome.
These are very, very interesting voices, and what you achieve is actually an intersection of mythical stories. The angles are very, very interesting, and I'm very glad you mentioned Clytemnestra. She's my favorite voice in the novel. I think you captured beautifully the revengeful mother in her, and I was wondering which is your favorite voice, if you have one.
It's really difficult to choose between them. The novel really began with Clytemnestra, because she's kind of in Greek mythology, she's the archetypal bad wife, and she's held up as this villainess, as this monster. But actually her actions are so easy to sympathize with, easy to understand, even though she goes to very extreme lengths of violence. She's motivated by this unbearable loss, by this terrible crime that her husband committed. So at the start, I felt like it was Clytemnestra, but honestly, as the novel unfolded and I was trying to understand what drove Electra, I started to find that I was more intrigued by this character in Greek mythology, who seemed so unsympathetic in so many ways, and so almost kind of an anti-feminist character as well, that she wants to uphold the patriarchy. She's devoted to her father and all the terrible things that he stands for. So I didn't think that I would find any connection with her. But to kind of view her as a child when the war begins and to start to unpick the kind of trauma, not just that she has suffered, but the intergenerational trauma that her family history uncovers, I thought actually gave me a way into her and a way of understanding her, even if I don't always agree with the actions that she takes and the decisions that she makes. She did start to take over the novel for me, and that's why it ended up being called Electra. Because I did find in the end that her story was a really brilliant one too.
Indeed, it is. And I strongly felt, I'm very curious whether you agree with me or not, that you tend to turn stories of violence, of hate, into stories of love. Because actually, Clytemnestra's love for her daughter, as well as Electra's love for her father, are the foundation of the entire conflict.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And Cassandra as well, her love for her city.
Yes.
You know, her city has ostracized her and treated her as an outcast and treated her as a monster in so many ways. Yeah, I think that's probably the way that I find my way into Greek mythology, into the heart of it, is to understand that those opposing forces are so powerful and equal, and that there is, as much as these women are driven by hatred, there is this really powerful core of love within them. And I think that's a way that we can really see them as human, as you know, fully relatable human beings.
Right. Cassandra is a very interesting, a very complex character. She matures as the story progresses. So does Electra, actually. But one thing I found fascinating was her, let's say, oblique perspective of Helen of Troy. So it's the way in which women see other women. And I think Cassandra's vision is in a way unique. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, to try and work out how people would see Helen was probably one of the most difficult parts of the novel, because Helen of Troy, Helen of Sparta, is so much a focus of other people's opinions all the time. Because everybody has got something to say about her, whether it's that they desire her so desperately, or whether they blame her for everything, or whether they are envious of her, or they want to possess her. She, because of her legendary beauty, she becomes this object to everybody, and nobody really ever seems to know who she is underneath that. And I felt that with Cassandra has got a unique way of seeing everybody, of seeing everything, and an understanding, I suppose, of the way the forces of fate and the gods interplay with human beings' free will, which is obviously very relevant when it comes to Helen, because everybody is trying to work out how much are we going to blame this one woman for this terrible cataclysmic war. And it clearly isn't all her fault. So I felt that Cassandra has got a unique way of sympathizing with Helen and understanding her, but also that Helen is always quite an impenetrable woman, that she is difficult to know and that she's difficult to understand. And that Cassandra struggles to find connection with people, because it's very hard to have a connection with somebody who can see your future, your fate, your destiny. It makes her terrifying in a lot of ways to a lot of people. So their relationship was one that I felt there would be a lot of nuance, a lot of complexity behind that relationship. And really that they are both in Troy as two outcasts, as two women that everybody's got an opinion on and nobody really understands.
Yes, they're definitely misunderstood women. Helen of Troy is maybe impenetrable and let's say like a threshold between gods and people. And by the same token, I think Cassandra, the way in which you describe Cassandra beautifully portrays her humanity as well.
Yeah, I really felt that with Cassandra, there is, she's such a sympathetic character, and you know, this affliction that's put upon her by Apollo is such a painful one that really tears her apart.
Also, the moment between Cassandra and Clytemnestra, where you practically redesign a mother-daughter moment, is very, very powerful in the novel. How did you come up with that?
So that really came from the way that their encounter was presented to me when I was studying classics when I was 18, was that I remember being told that Clytemnestra views Cassandra with this kind of sexual jealousy because she's Agamemnon's wife and he's brought home this captive woman as a prize from war. And that really didn't seem to ring true to me. That felt like quite a misogynistic way to view Clytemnestra, because by this point, she spent 10 years plotting Agamemnon's murder, and I didn't really feel that jealousy was exactly what she would feel. I felt she was much more likely to pity Cassandra, and because Clytemnestra is, like we said, driven by maternal love and maternal grief, that that extends to the way that she sees Cassandra. Cassandra is another victim of Agamemnon, just like Clytemnestra's daughter Iphigenia was. And so I wanted to keep their encounter the same, but to really change the motivations, because I think the way it's been presented before makes Clytemnestra a monster, and that's absolutely not the way that I saw her.
Yes, and in the same way, I'm personally thankful for the fact that you practically saved Cassandra from this part of the other woman that she plays in mythology. She is a victim as well, and you gave her that right to act as victim in your novel. That's beautiful, I think. Now, how would you define yourself as an author at this moment?
Oh, so that's really difficult to say. So I've just in the UK, I've just published my third novel, Atalanta, which feels like a really different kind of novel again. It's much more of an adventure story. It feels a lot more joyful in tone, and so at the moment, I think it's like it is a moment to sit back and take stock of where my career has brought me. But I just feel so lucky to have had the opportunity to write these books. And I think the great thing about Greek mythology is that it gives me the opportunity to write different kinds of books every time. There are almost kind of different genres within Greek mythology. There's tragedy, there's adventure, there's action, there's love stories. So I think that I just hope that I get the chance to keep on growing as an author and keep on evolving.
What interests you at the moment? Because within this frame of Greek mythology, you explore so many themes, as you yourself pointed out. There's trauma, there's this complexity of love, of the traitor-victim story, and so on. What interests you most at the moment?
So I became very interested when I was writing Atalanta in exploring the world of the gods a little bit more. Because in Atalanta, a major character in the novel is Artemis, who becomes Atalanta's almost kind of adoptive mother. Atalanta is her protege, is her champion, her mortal champion. And it was so interesting to me to explore what drives the gods, what motivates them, why they become entangled with mortal lives, because they are so very different to human beings. They operate on a very different moral plane, or an amoral plane, possibly, a lot of the time. So I'm very interested in kind of delving back further into the older mythologies about how the gods rose to power, how the Olympians rose to power. That's my current research project.
It's very interesting. Now, you make us examine the multiple ways in which one can look at a story in an era that often emphasizes oversimplified versions of a narrative. Yours are both intricate and highly pleasurable for the public. Now, did you intend that, or does it just come naturally? Do you work a lot for that, or is it just pure narrative instinct?
So I think it's probably a mixture of the two. I think with Greek mythology, there can be a temptation to go down too many sort of different paths and try to put too many stories in, because one always leads on to the other. Myths are so interconnected. So I always have to, that's where I think I have to really consider in editing, in making sure that people can read my novels without knowing anything about Greek mythology, that I will explain enough that I can take you along for the ride with me. But also that for people who are fascinated by Greek mythology, who love it, who are classicists, that there's plenty in there for them to enjoy and to see, hopefully from a different perspective as well. So it's a careful balance, and I think it's probably a mixture.
Yes, it is a mixture, a very interesting one and highly appealing, as I said before. Now, why does writing in the first person appeal to you?
Well, it's really interesting that you ask that, because actually the novel that I'm writing at the moment is the first time that I've come out of the first person.
Oh.
So it seemed the obvious way to tell Ariadne's story, my debut novel. The first person seemed absolutely right, because I was very much inspired by her letter in Ovid's Heroides, which is the part of that is the epigraph to the novel, where in Ovid's Heroides, Ariadne says, when Theseus, when you go back to Athens and you are boasting about your exploits, don't forget to mention me. And I really wanted to kind of to take that as my jumping off point, because Theseus did forget her. He took all the glory for himself. And so her telling her story in her own words was absolutely the point of that novel for me. That was the fundamental purpose of writing it. And when it came to write Electra, I just started writing in the first person because I think this is what had worked for me before, and it was still the same instinct for me that I want to give these women a voice and tell the story from their point of view. But I have found in my fourth novel that for some reason the first person doesn't seem right. So I think it can be a very individual decision for each book, actually.
And how do you break free from characters when you start on writing new ones?
So break free from characters I've written before?
Yes.
I think that was actually really another conscious decision in writing Electra, whereas I'd written Ariadne, who very much is a victim of circumstance, and although she wants to change things and she wants to make the world a better place, the odds are often so against Ariadne, and she's really kind of oppressed by the weight of these heroes and these gods and the expectations of the patriarchy that push her down all the time. And in writing characters like Clitemnestra, Electra, and Cassandra, I was really taking women who kick back against that very powerfully, who take all of their rage and turn it outwards, which is quite difficult often for women to do. We're quite often socialized to turn our anger inwards and to push it down and suppress it. So I really thought about building these women as women who were different in that way, who were not like Ariadne had been, but who were very determined to, rather than to try and make the world a better place, which I think is what Ariadne wanted to do, they want to take retribution for the wrongs that have been done to them.
I was very curious what kind of writers appeal to you and why, because it is very obvious that you have this extraordinary classical background, but your writing exhales such modernity that I'm simply curious about it.
Oh, well, so I would say that one of my favorite authors is Barbara Kingsolver, and my favorite of her books is The Poisonwood Bible, which is, so her writing is contemporary, but she's incredible in writing multiple narrative perspectives. And in The Poisonwood Bible, it's a story that's told by a mother and her 4 daughters. And so for me, it's like a masterclass in creating very distinct voices, very distinct characters, and a really interesting way of seeing how the same events change through the eyes of the different family members who experience them, and how they all have their own different spin on what happens to them. And it's such a beautifully constructed book in terms of the setting and the presence of nature in that novel as well. The environment is so kind of brilliantly evoked. So I think that she has been a huge influence on my writing.
How is the idea of a new book born? Because you write about Greek mythology, this is your starting point, and there are so many stories to choose from.
So it's been different every time, actually. With Ariadne, it came from reading a children's version of Theseus and the Minotaur to my children. I kind of jumped off from that to want to tell Ariadne's story. With Electra, I can't quite remember how exactly I decided I wanted to tell this story, honestly, but it was there. It was almost like it was kind of waiting to be uncovered in my mind, that it just sort of rose up, and I thought, this is the book that I want to write. And it was like kind of waiting for me. Choosing to write my third novel, Atalanta, actually came from a collection of short stories that I'd written that just for myself, just for pleasure. And I've got kind of a folder on my laptop, which has got about kind of 20 different women of Greek mythology, and just maybe 1,500 words from their point of view. And Atalanta was one of them. And I couldn't leave her there because I knew that there was so much more to tell. So sometimes they kind of come. Yeah, sometimes that's how I sort of picked her to write about. Yeah, it's quite difficult to point, I think.
And which was to you the most surprising voice you created?
So the most surprising probably would be Electra, because I did not know how on earth I was going to create this character. It was such a challenge. And I really had to invent a lot for Electra, because when we meet her, like you mentioned in Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus, we meet her as a grown woman. We don't find out about her childhood. We don't find out about what shaped her. We just find out that she is who she is when she comes on stage, which is that she is obsessed with her father and she despises her mother, and she's already set on her course of action when she appears in the tragedies. And so for me, there was so much unraveling of Electra's psyche to do. There was so much to work out about how she got to that point. And that created a lot of surprises along the way.
Well, I must say this was a very pleasurable conversation. My final question to you would be, which is the best part of writing to you?
So I really love when I get into the editing stage of writing, because I think the first draft is the most exciting part, and it's when there is so much potential and possibility, but it's also quite a lonely place to be in the first draft. And I really love it when I have it completed and I send it to my editor, and that's like inviting somebody else into the world with me. And that's the moment when I know somebody else wants to be there, and this is going to work, and we're going to transform it into what it is going to become.
Well, on behalf of your readers, I definitely want to be there. We all do. I'm very much looking forward to reading you again and to talking to you again. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much.